All right, folks, in the interest of time, I will get started on time. So hello, everyone. My name is Michael Mockney, and I'm going to try to run through this presentation as quickly as possible to leave at least some time for actual brainstorming at the end. Just to confirm, thank you very much for clicking through. All right, without further ado, let's discuss measuring performance for long-lived pages and single-page applications. So first, just a quick review. Historically, performance measurement was sort of heavily focused on the loading performance of navigations, typically measured browser internals such as network, DOM, JS directly. And while many of these metrics are still super useful, especially in development and lab testing, we've generally tried to evolve towards more user-centric measures in the field, such as focusing on the timing of content the user sees and the responsiveness of actual interactions. However, these user metrics are still very much tied to traditional navigations. For example, first contentful paint is, well, just the first paint after navigation. Largest contentful paint does update with new content, but only before first input or scroll. And first input delay reports experience, but only of the first input. So even our champion metric for full page lifecycle, cumulative layout shift, which does do a good job of capturing UX issues at any point in time, still uses a single threshold value for the whole load. So in order to get many meaningful metrics, we really rely on a nice steady stream of navigations. Now, the good news is that the trend is already strongly towards better handling full page lifecycle and all aspects of user experience for arbitrarily long-lived pages. For example, yesterday, Nicholas led a brainstorm session on responsiveness and interactivity, where he laid out how we could go from first input delay to all input end-to-end latency. That is, all inputs for the full page lifecycle. Also yesterday, Sadrul and Rob presented about animation smoothness and frame timing, another full page lifecycle metric. We're also working on improving CLS and thinking about paint timing to better capture very long-lived pages just in general. So the trend is good. That's the good news. However, we still rely on navigations, if for nothing else than for reporting and attribution to a specific URL. But as we know, sites use JavaScript to circumvent the need for traditional document navigations altogether. For example, single-page apps, which may use the history API some of the time, or infinite scrollers, which typically do not. And with single-page apps, route resources may load entirely on demand, similar to a normal navigation, or partially share templates and state, which is good, or just prefetch and preload everything entirely up front. This is not a new problem. What is a new problem, however, is that now browsers are getting in on the game too. We have a slew of new features which will rework how a user-perceived navigation actually works. For example, BF cache and closed tab cache. With this feature, the entire page is restored from memory without having to go to the network at all. It's great for speed. It also means performance metrics don't reset by default. It's important for developers to know when it's happening so they can optimize their pages for it and adjust any metrics or performance measurements accordingly. If you track visits to your site with an analytics tool, you may notice a decrease in the total number of page views reported. Or paint previews. This is a newer browser cold start session restore feature, where instead of showing a blank page while it loads, it shows a magic screenshot captured from the last browsing session. It's actually partially interactive, but this is using browser UI, not the renderer. At the moment, it looks like it has a limited effect on loading performance, but it does affect UX and the ability to measure interactions. And of course, prefetch, pre-render portals. With this feature, embedded content from other sites can be used to quickly create quick and seamless transitions. It's a special type of load, which is privacy preserving and will have no undesirable side effects using a subset of storage and API access. The pre-render is distinct from the eventual transition to the page. And there might be an event fired following activation to allow upgrading to a credentialed version. To me, it sounds a lot like a spa navigation. All this to say, from a performance perspective, what even is navigation anymore? So as evidenced by BF cache, performance implications are very nuanced. especially since the page loads being replaced would likely have been some of the fastest page loads in the dataset. Probably we have no alternative but to figure out on a case-by-case basis how to best identify each navigation, how to slice any ongoing post-load measurements, and where to report. But how do we reason about the different metrics? We've always had cross-origin versus same origin, cached versus non-cached, mobile versus desktop, 3G versus LAN time, etc. Yet it's always felt at least somewhat apples to apples to me. Some good apples, some bad apples. But with SPA route transitions, and now BF cache and portal activations, it feels a bit more like this to me. Why not? Let's add pine apples. That's the only joke I'm going to throw in there. So here's the final point. I expect vastly different performance profiles from the various navigation types once we put in all the work to even capture them correctly. And in the excellent web.dev article on BF cache, there's an excellent piece of advice given to perhaps annotate all page load metrics with their respective navigation type. Navigate, reload, back forward, pre-render. And this would allow you to continue to monitor your performance within each navigation type, even if the overall distribution skews. But this approach is only recommended for non-user-centric page load metrics, like time to first byte. For user-centric metrics, a better option is to report as accurately as possible what the user experiences. However, I'm left contemplating this. That advice works really well with perfect metric coverage. But what happens when navigations slip through the cracks? Or what happens when certain navigations are less frequent? Or when some are more important than others? Is a uniform merger between reports really what we want? All right, and as a recap before we actually open up for real brainstorm, first of all, good news, continuous full page lifecycle metrics are the future and they're coming. Identifying navigations is still very important, especially for attribution, but the web is evolving. That was the message from the keynote for BlinkOn, and it's nothing new. Navigation types are going to get more complicated, and I'd love to discuss how we all want to reason about various distributions. And with that, that's all I have. Let's open it up.
One question I have is how all this ties together with the revamp of the history API or the navigation API. I'm not sure like where it stands right now, but do you have thoughts on that front? And
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I see Dominic's on the call, so maybe I'll let him chime in a sec. But from my perspective, when adopted, so first of all, it's very nascent and there's some early work to investigate both fixing issues with the existing API, there's just a slew of things developers have to work around, as well as perhaps evolving it to better handle like single page app type use cases. At best, I see that as giving a clearer signal to the browser that these things exist. It still doesn't solve the fundamental problem of client-side SPA navigation isn't quite the same as an initial page load. There's just a completely different set of performance implications, different things you have to measure. It's not apples to apples. As well as, you know, once we have these things identified, how do we want to merge them? So the questions will still be there. I think it'll just get a lot easier once adopted, even if we get there. Dominic, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've only just started getting into the space, but I think the big conflict is whether, at least for core web vitals type purposes, whether these APIs are gameable, right? So if you just said all the time, oh look, I did a single page app navigation, look how fast it was because nothing blocked, then that obviously doesn't work. There's some ideas around like maybe you have to click on an A element or a form submission, and maybe that's less gameable, but I haven't really thought through all the details, and I'm not sure everybody has either.
There are also security implications of, like, if we say once this API was used, we can expose the next first paint. There are also security questions that this raises. And yeah, tying it to an actual user click may be a good.
Tell me more about those security issues.
We don't want to expose all panes for various security considerations like cross-origin leaks or history leaks. And so we somehow need to throttle it. Maybe a user click would be a good way to throttle.
That discussion with security folks has been ongoing, and we haven't heard a definitive, no, we can't do that. But yeah, we should
Like, one thing-
hear the
thing-
inverse?
So one thing that is nice about the current thinking on the new history API is that all the web developer use cases seem to be around same origin, top level navigations. So we can significantly restrict the scope, and that may help with some of these concerns. Not sure.
You mentioned gaming as a concern. I think I'm less worried about intentional gaming than I am about having really bizarre incentives. You can imagine a developer who like migrates to using this API and suddenly their metrics get a whole lot better because of that when it didn't actually improve their numbers, or vice versa, depending on sort of the set of transitions that they're annotating. One big piece of value I think we do get here is if we're trying to build some metrics around interactions that don't rely on signals like this, this gives us a little bit of sort of ground truth to compare against. If we have this big slew of cases where web developers have annotated, here's a big transition, we can sort of compare our heuristic-based metric to those metrics, and that feels like it'll provide a lot of value for us from sort of an analysis perspective.
I should mention what the actual integration is now that I've had a little time to think about it. Like one of the proposals, at least, is that you annotate an anchor element by saying, don't actually do a full navigation. I'll take over the navigation. And by the way, I'll give you a promise that finishes when that navigation does. And the browser can kind of make this a little, like a stronger contract, right? You can't just do this all over the place if it like does a loading spinner while your promise is outstanding. Or sometimes it just ignores your promise and does the actual navigation. Don't know about that one, but ideas.
I've often wondered if we could just like not worry about navigations and count those as part of the time when the page was performing badly. And then, you could slice it by top level origin that's showing in the URL bar to have your different site attribution. But like trying to have specific attribution of the developer saying when they're doing things is never going to be a perfect solution.
So what if we put a pin in the conversation of gaming or weird incentives? What about if the developer's doing all the right things and we're tracking it all the right ways? We hear that today for single page app developers, there are fewer reported navigations because we're just like not tracking them. But once we are able to gather these reports for all the right reasons, it might be the case that there are plenty more navigations for a single page app because they're lighter weight. They could be partial updates, like individual component things, and they might be updating the URL just to make it easier to sort of serialize and resume. And so I've heard feedback from a lot of developers that do this, that they treat that as users interact more because it's faster, and so they just stay on page more and there's more interactions, and that's why there are more like same origin navigations. But what if like the average weight or size or duration of a same origin navigation or a single page app navigation is just smaller? Like, do we want to treat it equivalent and blend the metrics together? Like, how do we reason about that? If you had one cross origin nav per 20 same origin, what do we do?
I think one option is to focus on what is an acceptable user interaction. And so you don't try to say, you don't try to say how big is this single page app navigation? Is it tiny? Is it large? Or same origin navigation? You just say any kind of same origin interaction should be able to take place in under n milliseconds. I don't care if it's a tiny partial update or you're updating the whole page, but this is the target. And then we can just measure how often people violate that target. And I think that kind of dodges the question of needing to kind of categorize as small interactions versus larger interactions.
Yeah, maybe it's reasonable to talk about like the distribution of times that you expect to respond, that like you expect like most of the time, most of your interactions to result in a fast response, but some fraction of interactions to result in a response that takes a longer amount of time because it involves some bigger transaction fetching a larger amount of data or whatnot, whether or not that's a navigation. And maybe there's, instead of saying like you should hit this number, you should like look for this bell curve. That's hard to probably explain to people though, I don't know.
Yeah. Also, it's on the one hand, there's like the common story around SPA navigations is that the first one may take longer, but then follow-up navigations are instant. When I hear that, I say like you can have a similar effect with MPAs if you aggressively prefetch on the first navigation and then you have everything in your cache. So it's not clear to me that the weight of the first navigation is, like from a user experience perspective, it could be larger than follow-up navigations once you're invested. Users are less likely to wait on a blank page when they arrive at a site first than when they're already invested and are waiting to click the buy now button. So they're willing to wait a second or more. So I don't really have a clear answer on how we should do this weighting, but just looking at distribution without taking into account the role of each one of those interactions is likely to lose information.
If we make the assumption that cross-origin navigations have sort of a different set of user expectations, like maybe that is the one categorization that's useful, is you have your cross-origin things and your same origin things. And so you try to bucket same origin navigations and single page app transitions, et cetera, all together. And then cross-origin navigations are a special snowflake. That seems possibly reasonable to me.
Do you mean, when you say cross-origin, do you mean like in the strict sense of this origin is different from that one? Like, I just think the breaking case of an app that actually is conceptually one thing to the user, but they have the resources spread around, or I mean, I don't even know, like request to CDNs and although I guess that can be addressed, but.
Well, but this is more about the origin of the document, I assume, not the origin of the sub-resources.
I think the argument still stands that there are experiences where the origin of the document is not consistent throughout a user journey, but that's reasonably rare, maybe? I don't know.
I think marketing landing pages could have a big effect on this.
Yeah, also checkout carts could also include that, where like flows that you go to. Yeah, but I agree that it's less of a common phenomenon.
There's already going to be a lot of incentives to move those experiences to a single origin, like arising from Privacy Sandbox and similar efforts, for instance.
Yeah.
And like for like the big entities, right? They'll have something like GFE or a major CDN that allows them to do that sort of rewriting, even if they're different front-end web servers that their CDN lets them rewrite, I would assume.
Yeah. You lose cookies in that. Like typically, you want those flows in order to have cookies, and you would lose cookies in the rewrite. But you make a good point that Privacy Sandbox efforts are also likely to make it hard to pass state, or hard to impossible to pass state in those kind of flows. So yeah, they're likely to stick on a single origin.
Yeah, because if the objective, right, is to have, because you want this check of flow to be on an origin which is able to both get the state from the experience you're just on plus some persistent state on that origin.
Yeah.
You start to like touch on the sort of ground that's actually like browsers are trying to remove.
Yep. Agree.
So there's a question in chat from Vadim Petrov. Can we add information to SPA frameworks? So I don't know if Vadim is still here, if he wants to expand on that. But I will say that we ideally, because of some of the history API conversation or the gaming question that was raised earlier, ideally we would be able to track this from the platform itself, so that browsers would be able to have a very clear signal what's happening, because different SPA frameworks work very differently, and what is considered a sort of route changes, it can be quite different. On the other hand, for diving into your own performance metrics for your own websites, it's certainly very helpful to sort of dive deep within the SPA framework. And I think there is some room for cooperation with SPA framework authors to sort of help annotate route changes and performance slice to particular subsections of the page, especially as we move to full page lifecycle measurements. So I do think there is value to working with SPA frameworks and to help here. But ideally, the way that would happen is that the frameworks would adopt to new web platform primitives that just help do this out of the box sort of thing. That would be the ideal end state.
So
yep.
I have some questions. So it's not clear to me. I mean, we tried to define those navigations as something that is uniform on SPA, like SPA frameworks like React and so on. But some applications actually don't use those frameworks and have custom navigation internally for partial page updates. So if you have, for example, a document editing app, a navigation could be moving from one place to another in that content app. So how would you detect that except using some kind of annotation? I mean, that's the way I'm thinking about this, adding some kind of annotation when you switch to a different location. You signal the platform. It's similar to the way element timing works, where you kind of specify an attribute with an identifier.
Correct. So I will even point out that React, as far as I'm aware, out of the box doesn't even have routing support. You don't even need to use the history API. It's just like a component UI library. There are layers on top of it where folks use React Router or whatnot to do that. There's also all sorts of reasons to use the history API in ways that don't map to anything like a navigation. Like Google Docs, when you hit a header, will update the fragment URL just to make it easier to sort of copy paste. And then there are times where there are big route changes that don't actually update. You could do routing without using the history API or URL for changes. So it's not one-to-one, it's quite complicated. In terms of annotating, you know, what Dominic was discussing in terms of the history API proposal changes, you would use a certain browser primitive that would by default do the right things, like update the URL and give you the promise. And so it'd be a clearer signal. If you just rely on hints, you know, it could be done pretty frequently, which is part of the problem I see, and that's where the gaming concerns come in. There are even examples of folks using history API to do like animations in the URL bar. It's pretty frequent. So you might want to rely on a set of heuristics, like if there was a user interaction and a developer annotation and it led to some network usage and DOM update, and all of these things are satisfied, that constitutes a navigation. So perhaps something like that is possible, where it's a set of things together.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds reasonable if you add additional signals besides the sum annotation on the page itself. It makes sense. But the question, do we want to give the developers the flexibility to control what are the signals that indicate a navigation, or we want to have a preset of rules that would define that?
I think that's a false choice, probably. I think we need to do both things. There needs to be a way where developers can, with strong control over their site and deep understanding, annotate all the little bits they care about and deeply understand them. But we also want the kind of out-of-the-box strategy that lets you kind of compare between sites and have something out of the box that doesn't require that sort of deep instrumentation. So I think we're probably going to need to go with both approaches.
Alrighty, we're approaching end of time. Since we do have 2 more minutes, I wanted to perhaps leave you folks with another confusing thought that to drive you nuts, maybe. But you know, Chrome is now adding BF cache support, and we spent so much time figuring out the implications on performance because we didn't want this new feature, which is a performance improvement, to appear as a performance regression. But Firefox, by my read, has had this feature since 2005. And BF caches have been ignored in RUM metrics on Firefox forever because that was the default state. And that was the distribution folks are accustomed to. How many other features are we accustomed to and is just the current state of the world that we are trying to keep stable that never should have been? So another example that I think Yoav gave was, you know, tab switching. We are accustomed to desktops where tabs are always live, like a BF cache, or for background things that are never destroyed. But on mobile, a tab switch might very well mean reload. And so more resource-constrained devices, which force reloads more often, which are slower for users, appear to have more positive metrics because those are the types of loads that are the fastest. So, you know, we are currently taking a hodgepodge of different navigation types and merging them all together according to the real world, because that's what users see. And that's the running thesis we've been going on. But I'm increasingly concerned that that's not necessarily a good default. I don't know that the baseline is actually so well thought out or clean. And so in terms of the advice on the BF cache article, I think is fantastic. You know, track each type based on its own, measure its own performance, and that way you could track how well you're doing in isolated silos. And then it doesn't matter if the skew between them changes affecting your overall metrics. And we need to figure out how to blend those two perspectives. And with 1 minute left, I don't know if anyone wants to add anything. Otherwise, we'll have to stop the recording.
That just really pushes me towards some of the earlier discussions around counting every reload or slow interaction or navigation kind of in the same bucket. It's really interesting.
All right. Thank you, folks. Very exciting. Have a good one.